What's up, horror fans? Did you know Jessie Buckley and Christian Bale's latest take on The Bride of Frankenstein is about to hit the cinemas? It got me wondering, how is The Bride of Frankenstein still a culturally relevant character in horror after 90 years since the original appearance? Especially in spite of all of the reasons that it really shouldn't have been. The good news is, I'm going to break it all down for you. But before that, are you a monster in need of companionship? Well, join the family and subscribe today. So you've seen it before, right? Even if you've never watched a single black and white horror movie, you know this character. The tall hair, the white streaks, the bandages, those wide, terrified eyes. The Bride of Frankenstein is one of the most recognizable horror figures ever created. But here's the strange part. She's only in the movie for like 2 minutes. Not 10, not a full act, 2 minutes. So how did a character with less screen time than most cameos become one of the most iconic monsters in history? Well, that's because The Bride of Frankenstein isn't really about a monster. It's about loneliness. And strangely, the most powerful moment in the whole movie isn't when someone dies, it's when someone says no. However, before we start looking at the movie, we need to look at the landscape that the movie was released into. It was 1935, and that was the year that horror became censored under the Hays Code. This movie couldn't expect a release if it had the same levels of violence and sexualization that films like Dracula or Frankenstein had found success with in the earlier 30s. Also, in the 1930s, female characters at the time existed as damsels to be saved or prizes to be won, or just as support structures for male protagonists. Remember all of this, because everything that I explain after this will make so much more sense. Context is key. So before we get to the bride, we need to talk about the creature that she was made for, the potential husband of the Bride of Frankenstein. At the end of the original Frankenstein film, the monster is supposedly destroyed in a burning windmill. You know, the whole classic angry villagers thing, torches, the medieval equivalent of a 1-star Yelp review, except he survives. And in the sequel, the monster isn't treated like the villain anymore. He's treated like a lost person. He's wandering the countryside, confused, hunted, and completely alone. Everywhere he goes, the humans interact with him in the same way. Fear that leads to violence. Now, the monster never starts the conflict. He just reaches out and people attack. And that brings us to the actual villain of the movie, Dr. Pretorius. He's trying to continue Frankenstein's work. He forces Dr. Frankenstein back into his experiments with an idea that changes horror forever. If the monster suffers because he is alone, then we create him a companion. This is one of the first times a horror movie asks a very strange question. What if the monster isn't evil, just unwanted? Nowadays, this is considered a trope of the character, and it's why he seems to have befriended everyone from Alvin and the Chipmunks to Scooby-Doo. Basically the whole of pop culture. The movie really doubles down on this when Frankenstein's monster encounters this blind hermit. Now the hermit can't see what the monster looks like, and so for the first time in his life, someone actually treats him like a person. He learns to speak from the hermit, who shares food with him, and more importantly, friendship. For a brief moment, the monster's happy. This scene's actually really important to the history of horror, because it changes what a monster can be. The basis for all horror is fear, and it should fall apart when the audience stops fearing the monster, but it doesn't. We start to fear what will happen to him. We fear for him. Of course, humans eventually find him and they drive him away again. Not because of anything that he did, just because of what he is. This is the point that Frankenstein's monster learns something worse than physical pain. He gets his first taste of rejection. So this all leads towards the most famous moment in the movie. The laboratory, the storm, the experiment. Frankenstein and Pretorius have finally succeeded and they create life again. This is when the bride awakens. She doesn't walk like a monster. She moves like a newborn animal. Confused, defensive, and terrified. The hissing isn't an act of aggression, it's fear. And then the creature sees her. For the first time in his existence, someone like him exists. Someone who might understand him. He reaches out to her, not to hurt her, but to connect. And she screams one of horror's most famous screams. She rejects him instantly. Not because he attacked her, and not because he's threatening her. It's because she's afraid of him, just like everyone else. In that moment, the monster realizes something devastating. Even someone made exactly like him cannot love him. Before this moment, horror was simple. There was a monster and you just had to survive. But something has changed now. But this changed the horror into something else. You understand the monster. The creature didn't become dangerous because he was born evil. He became dangerous because he learns he will always be alone, and he grieves for a life that he cannot have. He feels despair of an isolation he can never escape. And in the film's final act, he makes a choice that no horror villain has really ever made before. He chooses to die. He allows Dr. Frankenstein and his partner Elizabeth to escape.
You live! Go!
And destroys the laboratory with Pretorius and the bride inside. Not out of revenge, just out of despair. I mean, sure, the monster's defeated, but he's not defeated in the normal sense that the audience was expecting. And this moment's reshaped horror forever. The concept changed after The Bride of Frankenstein. Monsters stopped being just threats. It was really the birth of the tragic monster trope. King Kong had touched on it slightly beforehand, but The Bride of Frankenstein really perfected and humanized it. And you can see this everywhere now. Characters like Edward Scissorhands or Carrie. You could even argue to an extent that characters like Leatherface or Jason have a sympathetic element to them. This level of sympathy towards the monster, which really drives the depth of character.
We belong dead.
But that's enough about Frankenstein's monster. We want to talk about the bride. Well, the bride herself, she's left a massive legacy. Her design became one of the most referenced character looks in cinema. Parodies, cartoons, Halloween costumes. She's been referenced for nearly a century, and filmmakers keep trying to create that same emotional story. Sequels and spin-offs constantly revisit the concept of giving the monsters companion. Even comedic horror like The Bride of Chucky plays with the idea. A monster honestly becomes much more interesting when it has that connection to something other than just sheer destruction. And honestly, I think Tiffany Valentine might be my personal favourite bride in all of horror. But a good bride holds up a mirror to the monster, and it allows you to see what's actually there. There would be various appearances for The Bride of Frankenstein, movies like Young Frankenstein, but most of these appearances and parodies have been about it. Well, that was for the first 50 years. It wasn't until 1985 that The Bride got a full-on starring role. This movie asks the question, what if the bride had lived on? Well, the original appearance had dealt with themes of rejection and the character's significance to Frankenstein's monster. This take is themed about the bride and her discovery of herself and her identity. Her capability to learn sees her taught language, manners, and eventually independence, and the understanding that she was being used. Jennifer Beals was playing the character this time round, and she's cast up against Frankenstein, who was played by Sting from the band The Police. In this feature, she was reunited with Frankenstein's monster again. This time, instead of rejecting him in fear like she did the previous time, she rejects him because she wants to choose her own life. And while it's quite a different take on the character, the 1985 version really understands what's at the heart of the bride. And that brings us to why the bride still matters today. Beyond being a goth fashion icon, the bride isn't really about electricity and experiments and really cool hair. She represents body autonomy and the freedom to choose. The bride only appears for minutes, but in those few brief moments, she became one of horror's first feminist on-screen icons. And this was in the culture of the 1930s, where women were still being raised and educated solely for the purpose of being good wives. And the bride was a character literally manufactured for this purpose and rejects it to be her own person. And most importantly, she does it with no lines of dialogue, only a scream. Despite having her voice taken away, she somehow speaks up for herself. She shows that she would rather die than live a life that's predetermined for her. She's a character in horror that doesn't stand out based on how or why she dies, but how she would have lived. And that's why The Bride of Frankenstein is still remembered, and more importantly, still matters 90 years later. Let me know in the comments if you plan to see The Bride 2026. Oh, and if you've already seen it, let us know if you'd recommend it. If you found the history of The Bride to be interesting, drop a like on this video. It really helps out my tiny little channel and equally tiny little rental store. Until next time, I'm Jay. This is Jay's VHS Rentals. Be kind and rewind.